Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more. And today we're going to talk about both the gift and the curse that Ralph McQuarrie's art offers Star Wars. It's the defining element of the visual aesthetic. It's the artist behind the scenes that kind of crafted the double helix of the Star Wars DNA for everything to sort of live in. Sounds like a brilliant undertaking, right? And I would agree it is. However, it's not without a cost, and we will get to that eventually. But in order to do so, we're going to lay a breadcrumb trail. Now, to be fair, this may be a part 1 of 2, and part 2 may not come for some time, but just because it's not mentioned in this video doesn't mean it's not being mentioned. So if there's a particular piece of McQuarrie art that you find frustrating wasn't mentioned, give me a little bit of time, and perhaps I will satisfy your little desires. Or big desires, you know what I mean? DMs are open. Anyway, perhaps the single most iconic thing about Star Wars is its unique visual style. Up until Star Wars was released in 1977, science fiction films were usually defined by a glossy, smooth, futuristic look to them. Think Flash Gordon, or 2001: A Space Odyssey, a Kubrick film, which I didn't watch until I was an adult, but I think that's the right time to do so. Some mature concepts in there that I'm not sure I would have been ready for as a young lad. It's also one of the things that bored me about science fiction as a kid, is that everything looks stupid to me. It just looked very much like a Hollywood set and had a hard time enticing my imagination to the universe in which it lived. White walls, glistening, glowing, and sparkling, are just not as impressive as what we see in Star Wars. And I think that's actually metaphorically given to you in the opening sequence of A New Hope, where the white walls are destroyed by the Empire, and it's kind of a statement about what he's getting ready to do to the notion of science fiction films. When developing Star Wars, George Lucas wanted to create what he called a lived-in universe, a term that is vastly overused now and part of kind of the pop culture vocabulary, but his general thought was that everything shouldn't look like it rolled off the assembly line. The reasons for this were twofold. Lucas wanted to convey a specific point in time in the universe he was creating, where the ordinary people were suffering under the might of a totalitarian regime. He also felt it simply made the film look more believable. When developing Star Wars, he commissioned concept artist Ralph McQuarrie to create a series of paintings to help visualize the world he was writing. McQuarrie, a then 40-something-year-old veteran of the Korean War, had been working as an aerospace artist for Boeing. Fun fact, McQuarrie narrowly survived a direct headshot during the war, when the bullet became lodged in the netting of his helmet. I can't help but think that has something to do with the Boba Fett helmet. But anyway, he had done some limited work on film concept, but that was it. It was by no means his trade or even something he had any experience in. Despite this, Lucas was struck by his unique visual style. McQuarrie's paintings were instrumental in Star Wars existing at all. Without them, it's likely 20th Century Fox would never have agreed to finance the film. As Lucas's early scripts and descriptions were notoriously vague and hard to follow, the paintings put an image to the high concept film he wanted to create. It's a lot harder of a sale when you sit down with Hollywood execs and you're like, look, so this farm kid is going to hang out with this giant dog guy, and then him and 2 robots are going to get this space wizard and go, you know what I mean? It's just a hard sale. It was McQuarrie's suggestion that Vader should be helmeted with a breathing apparatus. Lucas had only suggested he should be tall and an intimidating samurai-like character. His painting of R2-D2 and C-3PO crossing the desert was what convinced actor Anthony Daniels to take the part of 3PO. McQuarrie continued to design much of Empire and Jedi, and while many of his designs were adapted and made real by talented artists, model makers, and special effects supervisors, his work was without a doubt the single most important element in creating Star Wars visual style. McQuarrie didn't work on the prequels, with those films adopting a different style, more akin to the 1950s Americana. But his work on the original trilogy kept him in a legendary status. With this in mind, when development started on the sequel trilogy, first under George Lucas and then under Disney, a priority of artists like Doug Chiang was to go back to the foundation of the series and what made it look special. One of the main criticisms of the prequel trilogy was that they had moved too far from the used universe aesthetic. It's important to remember in 2012 and 13, there were very few defending that trilogy, and it was still largely seen as a colossal disappointment. Today, of course, it has become rightfully recognized for its many merits, its unique visual design chiefs among them. But this just wasn't the case a few years ago. And I think it's important that while people were turned off by the visual aesthetics of the prequel trilogy, it also said something about the time that those characters were living in. And it gave each trilogy a unique and dynamic visual style for each. And while it all seemed part of the same fabric, they were definitely knit into 2 different garments, while both maintaining an identity that seemed like it could have come from the same manufacturer. Now keep in mind, at this same time, Dave Filoni was developing Star Wars Rebels, and this whole visual and animation style was entirely based on McQuarrie paintings. However, this series was developed independently of the sequels, and that's a discussion for another time. Now, the sequel trilogy, conversely, used a lot of McQuarrie's unused designs, reinterpreted many, but definitely inspired the major body of visual work, which, when Episode 7 released, made people feel very nostalgic and gave people the notion of the return of what they expected visually from Star Wars. However, my issue with it is that it doesn't do what the prequels did in that regard, which was create its own sort of visual identity, and ends up looking more like the original trilogy. Now that we have the background information out of the way, let's talk about the McQuarrie use during the Disney era specifically. Perhaps the most prominent McQuarrie designs used for the sequel trilogy is the updated T-70 X-Wing. Like many other returning ships from the original trilogy, it is extremely similar to the original with one significant difference: the scissor wings that join together when not in attack mode. It also has blue markings and a slightly different nose shape of the McQuarrie art. Despite it being extremely similar to the original, this model does make sense in universe as an updated, sleeker version of the original. The same can't be said for some others, but more on that later. BB-8 was also based on a McQuarrie work, if only conceptually. At one point, McQuarrie and Lucas envisioned R2 as being attached to a giant ball bearing, allowing him to turn in any direction, much like BB-8. Perhaps the most numerous examples are those of the background aliens seen throughout the film. Like these folks, feral ape-like aliens seen in Maz's castle, they're pulled almost perfectly from Ralph's Cantina concept art. Rey's desert costume with her goggles and head wrap bears a strong resemblance to concept art of Star Killer Hero, the unnamed female protagonist who was originally filling the Luke Skywalker role in the original trilogy. First Order snowtroopers also bear a distinct symbol on their chest plate pulled from McQuarrie's Hoth paintings. Imperial snowtroopers were seen bearing it on their helmets. Kylo Ren's fiery lightsaber also looks like early paintings of Ralph's done for A New Hope. Perhaps one of the strangest examples, however, is the gate entrance to the Nema outpost in The Force Awakens, the one Rey, Finn, and BB-8 run through when being chased by TIE fighters. This gate is lifted exactly from Ralph's designs for a Jabba's Palace gateway. What makes it so strange? That same year, only months prior, the gateway also appeared on the planet Takobo in the Rebels episode The Future of the Force, the one that created numerous YouTube clips of Ahsoka Tano dealing with two Inquisitors. It looks exactly the same as the one in The Force Awakens. This is only one of several instances of the filmmakers, particularly Abrams, failing to properly communicate their plan with other parts of Lucasfilm. The situation repeated itself again with The Last Jedi, which continued the trend of reusing McQuarrie's artwork, albeit to a far less egregious extent than The Force Awakens. The new A-Wing was lifted exactly from McQuarrie's artwork for Return of the Jedi. It has a sleeker profile, different cannons, and blue markings. However, just a year previously, the same concept art A-Wing debuted in Star Wars Rebels as a prior model to the one seen in Return of the Jedi. Same cannons, same markings, same everything. Thankfully, the proportions are quite different to the show's versions, meaning this is more easily fudgeable in canon than two identical gateways on completely different planets. In general, though, the carryovers from McQuarrie's work were far more subtle this time around. Snoke's throne was lifted from a piece depicting a possible volcanic lair for the Emperor. The Canto Bight police officers are based on a sketch done to design the Royal Guards for Jedi, but the majority of the film's new vehicles and locations, the Raddus, the Supremacy, the ATMS, were new and wholly original designs. The Rise of Skywalker, like the film before it, actually uses mostly original designs. Mostly. The Resistance Y-Wing, a sleeker, though still battered version of the one seen in the original trilogy, is pulled straight from Ralph's New Hope artwork, and the trailer shot of one barrel rolling towards a Star Destroyer cannon is an homage to Ralph's famous attack on the Death Star painting. Similarly to that big red gate, however, it does bring up some serious in-universe questions, or issues, depending on how you look at it. The intention of the original Y-Wing, even back in '77, was that it was an old, battered bomber acquired by the fledgling rebellion. Its skeletal piecemeal look was deliberately designed to suggest it had once been sleek and armored, but years of service and its outdated nature meant the rebels had acquired them in poor condition. This idea of Lucas's was fully realized in 2008 when Season 1 of the Clone Wars introduced the Republic's sleek, armored yellow Y-Wings, the same ones that would be broken down for parts and scrapped in Star Wars Rebels, with a few falling into the hands of the rebellion. So why 30 years later, with technology seemingly improving, would an updated new model of of the Y-Wing look so stitched together and run down? Of course, we know the answer. JJ has always strived to keep all of his updated designs as absolutely close to the original trilogy as possible. But unless the Resistance designed an entirely new Y-Wing, only for all of these to lose their armor again in exactly the same fashion, it's definitely a case of nostalgia over logic. There are likely some background aliens with at least inspiration from McQuarrie, but the strongest by far is Palpatine's Sith throne on Exegol. The spiky stone creation is lifted straight from the sketch Ralph did as a possible Emperor's throne for Return of the Jedi. And like I said, we're only touching on a few things here of many, and we haven't really even dug into Rebels yet. But let me tell you what my issue is with this. I love Star Wars. I love Ralph McQuarrie's art. I love the original trilogy. And I think that Ralph McQuarrie's art should continue to be somewhat of a color palette for designs moving forward. However, the original trilogy will always be the original trilogy, and it is stuck in this time capsule that for whatever reason gets a pass on a number of things and is extremely beloved but often forgiven. And as a result, everybody wants that same leniency and tries to pull from the original trilogy. But this series cannot maintain what makes it special and cannot survive in ongoing ages unless it evolves, unless it changes. And the more that they sit squarely on the pyramid built by Lucas, McQuarrie, and the other folks involved in the original trilogy, the less meaningful their material will ever be. Star Wars should be something that draws from the same color palette, but continues to paint different, unique, and special canvases, uniquely identifiable to each additional story. Every one of these trilogies has its shortcomings, but in my opinion, biggest shortcoming of the sequel trilogy is how much it wants to stand on the shoulders of the original trilogy instead of growing to its own height to be a pair of shoulders for someone else to be inspired by. And part of that lies in the gift and the curse, which is McQuarrie art. No art should be used fundamentally, but instead be used as inspiration to make the next great piece. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying sane. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.